Today's gospel lesson begins with an introduction about the need to pray always and not lose heart. Then it seems to turn into a story about justice. And finally, it ends with a question about faith. Prayer, persistence, justice, and faith. Why is Luke putting these different themes together? Let's take a look, because it's interesting that Luke begins the passage writing this. Then Jesus told them a parable about their need to pray always and not to lose heart. Nice. All right, I'm going to get a story about prayer. But then we meet our heroine in today's parable. She's a widow, which is a symbolic stand-in for Luke to represent the marginalized and the vulnerable. But Jesus doesn't tell us that she was in the temple praying or that she was home keeping vigil. This widow is on the move. Facing a life of obstacles, Jesus tells us that she confronts the judge of the city. Now, the judge represents the powerful elite of Jesus' day, in stark contrast to the poor widow. Jesus tells us that this judge neither feared God nor had respect for people. Well, clearly he's not the kind of judges we have in Norcross. But the widow is said to keep going to this judge and saying over and over again, "Grant me justice. Grant me justice against my opponent." It says this probably went on for a while. Again and again, she went day after day, not giving up. And eventually, her persistence paid off. But it wasn't because the judge was a good person, right? The judge was an awful person. The text says he just wanted her to stop bothering him. So he finally gave in and granted her justice. So the parable is introduced by saying it's about prayer and not losing heart, and then the story ends up being about the widow's persistence in seeking justice. Well, it seems to me then that Jesus is saying that the widow's actions were part of her prayer. Jesus is linking prayer and action. We've heard about prayer and justice a lot in Luke. They're recurring themes. We know that Jesus modeled a life of prayer since we find him frequently praying in Luke's gospel. A few chapters ago, Jesus taught the disciples the Lord's Prayer. And the entire gospel has been about the righting the injustices in the world toward the poor and the marginalized. Now Jesus is teaching the disciples another prayer. And this prayer has to do with acting for justice. Jesus is showing us that the widow is a model of endurance, about not becoming discouraged when things are hard, and about faithful persistence in the face of injustice. And he's saying that all of this is a new kind of prayer. It's a prayer about fighting for justice, about doing what's right, as a kind of embodied, living prayer. So perhaps it's beginning to make sense why Luke combined the themes of prayer, persistence, and justice as a way to teach us that what we are called to do. But persistence in prayer and in fighting for justice is about us. It's about our role. And so I wonder, what about God? Where is God in all of this? What does God make of our prayers and our persistence? My preaching professor recently reminded me that the parables, well, yes, they teach us certainly something about discipleship. But above all, the parables are there to teach us about God. Maybe even about God's very nature, who God is. So what does this parable teach us about God? For starters here, thank goodness, in this parable, God isn't being depicted as the unjust judge. In other parables, God does play the role of judge. But I think there's a clue at the end of the passage. Jesus ends the parable by saying this: "Listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God grant justice to those who cry to God day and night? Will God delay long in helping them? I tell you, God will quickly grant justice to them." See, Jesus is saying that, okay, you see this unjust judge in the story? How horrible he is, and yet he gave in to this poor, worthless widow. So if this horrible, awful judge would give in to this worthless widow, then how much more will God grant us justice, since we are God's people? So the parable is teaching us that our God is a God of justice. God cares then about our persistence in prayer. But the widow's example is there to show us that we don't just sit back and wait for things to happen, for God to intercede. We keep going, even when it's hard. Sometimes we do just have to render all that we are and put all of who we are into this living, persistent prayer so that we can keep going. And we have inspiring examples. Moses didn't give up. When God told him to go confront Pharaoh and say over and over again, "Let my people go," Moses didn't give up. He kept going. And Hannah, remember Hannah? She was barren. She was told she wouldn't have children, but she kept on praying and praying. They called her a drunk. They called her a worthless woman. Yet she didn't believe that that was right. Her prayer paid off, and God granted her a son, the prophet Samuel. And we have the example of Isaiah. He didn't give up when his people were exiled to Babylon, when his world had been destroyed. He didn't give up because he said, "No, I believe that God will comfort us again, because I hear a voice crying out, 'In the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight in the desert a highway for our God,' because the Israelites are returning home." God's people does not give up. There's also Ruth and Naomi. They didn't give up. Though they were penniless, homeless, and had no means for survival, no husband, but they did survive. They kept going. So did Mary. Thank God Mary said yes to God. Even though this crazy thing had just been announced to her and she didn't understand it, and she had this sense that it was going to change her life forever, but she kept going. And she gave birth to a baby and named him Jesus. The disciples kept going too. After Jesus' death, resurrection, and ascension, they didn't quit. They developed a life of prayer, and they went into action, spreading the gospel to the ends of the earth. Thank God, too, that Peter and Paul didn't give up, right? Because Peter and Paul recognized that Gentiles needed to be part of this new Jesus movement. Many people challenged them, though, and they said, "No, Gentiles aren't like us. They're different. They don't belong." But Peter and Paul didn't give up on God's vision of inclusion for all of God's people. Our biblical tradition is full of people of faith who overcame many obstacles to persevere in the face of injustice. We can think of many people today whose lives of living embodied prayer are also inspiring examples. I think of the people of Haiti, now recovering from yet another natural disaster. It's one of the poorest countries in the world, but they don't give up. They keep going. I read a news story about them crawling through rubble, still putting on what finest clothes they had left to go worship God last week in what were ruined church buildings. They didn't give up. They kept going. I think of Syrian families seeking safe places to resettle after their country has been ravaged by war. Despite many nations, cultures, and people turning their backs on them, they don't give up. They keep searching for a new home where they can live their lives and flourish. I think of Central American families and the children especially, whose parents see no other option than to send them by themselves to the U.S. border with hopes that here they would find a better life than if they stayed at home in their towns, which are ravaged by gang violence. I also think of this parish family, including our Hispanic congregation, today celebrating its 16th anniversary. And all of us here, worshiping God, discerning what we are called to do next, how we are called to persist in prayer and in fighting for justice. How we, as living branches on God's vine, will keep going for many years to come. But why? Why put in all this effort? Because, I believe, we worship a generous God. Because if this unfaithful, awful man of a judge would grant justice to this poor, meek widow, then how much more will God grant justice to us, God's people? And so we keep going because we believe that God's very essence is justice. Today, Jesus is saying that prayer, persistence, and justice, all of them together, have something to do with this life of faith. So even when times get hard, sometimes we just have to put all of who we are, gather all of what we hope for, all of what we believe, and put that into our life and our prayer to keep going to. In the name of God, undivided Trinity.
Amen.
Amen.